Good morning. My name is Christine Graham. As one of the Scottish Parliament's Deputy Presiding Officers, it gives me great pleasure to officially welcome you here to Holyrood and our excellent debating chamber for the 2019 Modern Studies Association Annual Conference. As a former secondary school teacher myself many moons ago, it is pleasing to see such a large turnout. This particularly, as I know many of you will have travelled quite a distance to be here today, and setting off for Edinburgh at any time might not be a good idea, but it certainly isn't on a cold and dark morning. So I commend you for your efforts. It's fitting that the Association is holding its annual conference here in the Scottish Parliament, and this, our 20th anniversary year. I've been here 20 years, believe it or not. I came in as a child. I believe the last time we hosted was almost 10 years ago, back in 2010, and it caused me to reflect on how much the political landscape has changed in the intervening period. Cast your minds back, and David Cameron and Nick Clegg were basking in the glow of their political honeymoon following that famous press conference in Downing Street's Rose Garden. And here, closer to home, the Scottish National Party were in the closing months of their first period of minority government. Minority government, quite unusual in the UK. Across the pond, Barack Obama was into the second year of his historic presidency, and referenda on our membership of the European Union and Scottish independence seemed set way into the future. And of course, the B word meant an entirely different thing altogether. Who coined it, I wonder? They're going to take credit in the Oxford Dictionary for it. Now, I do not intend to provide a run-through of all the political events and highlights over the past 20 years. You would be the wrong audience for that. And anyway, you don't want to hear it from me particularly. But I think it's fair to say that this has been eventful over the past few years. There are, of course, other words I could have chosen, but as Deputy Presiding Officer, I have to put my political affiliations on the back burner. I wonder what they are. I'll settle for that one. And as we head for another UK general election before the year is out, I'm sure you're looking forward to it. I'm ready to go round the doors with a Santa on my hat on my head and a sparkly brooch. Don't think it'll do me any good. We're likely to be further changes down the track. Now, it's not often that I quote people, but I'll quote the US Secretary of Defence, Donald Rumsfeld, in this chamber for his infamous quote to do with the upcoming election. If you can get your head around this, you're a better man than I am, Gunga Din. As we know, there are no knowns. There are things we know. We also know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things we do not know, but there are also unknown unknowns. Was he well at the time, I asked myself. Macmillan also famously said, events, dear boy, events. Because no matter what people think they're going to fight a general election on, it often turns out to be something quite different. And of course, Harold Wilson's famous line, a week is a long time in politics. We could say 24 hours is a long time in politics now. Anyway, politicians, commentators and practitioners of modern studies alike, you've certainly got an interesting and eventful future. I can think of all the books that are going to be written, the analysis, the tutorials, all about what happened 2019, 2020. So, on to today's event. We will shortly hear from our two keynote speakers, Dr. Alan Britton, Senior Regional Advisor for Tayside at Education Scotland, and Dr. Kate Dommett, Senior Lecturer and Director of the Crick Centre for the Public Understanding of Politics at the University of Sheffield. Following their addresses, I will ask Dr. Britton and Dr. Dommett to join me in the chamber floor here for a question and answer session, at which I would encourage as many questions as time allows. Afterwards, I'm pleased to say we'll hear from Gordon Black, Trustee of the Modern Studies Education Trust, before he joins me in handing out awards to our prize winners. We'll conclude this morning's opening plenary with a vote of thanks by Ruth Sharp, member of the MSA National Committee. Now, before I invite our first speakers-elect, can I close by once again welcome you all here to your Parliament. On behalf of my MSP colleagues, I'd like to wish you a very productive and successful conference. Thank you. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Alan Britton, Senior Regional Advisor for Tayside Education Scotland, to speak. Dr. Britton has taken up his role at Education Scotland this year and has experience of working in education over the 3 years, covering a variety of roles, from lecturing at the University of Glasgow School of Education and teaching modern studies, French and English at secondary schools. Dr Britton previously worked in the Scottish Parliament back in 1999 when he escaped. No, it doesn't say that. It says where he set up and managed the education service. And we're pleased to have him back here today. Dr Britton, please. Oh, there we are, Dr Britton.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction. That was probably the most solemn start to any kind of conference that I've ever encountered, walking down as you all sat in silence. It didn't augur very well for the remainder of the proceedings, but hopefully we can liven it up a wee bit. Can I begin, though, by thanking the Parliament and the MSA for the opportunity to speak at part of what I'm grounded in here is an intense nostalgia, 20 years on from when I first started working at the Parliament in one of the most exciting professional periods of my life. So it's really nice to be back here. I'm imposing quite a lot of self-discipline on myself, though, not to wallow in that nostalgia and to try and move on to spend a wee bit of time dwelling on the past and how we got there, but to the present and also to the future. But I'd also like to thank you as an audience of modern studies teachers for coming along on a Saturday. For some of us, we've had to give up watching the rugby. So far, I don't know anything about the game, and if I can keep it that way, that would be great. So no messages, and please nobody shouting out if you've got an earpiece in. So, in terms of the structure of what I'm going to say, obviously I'm going to be brief, but I want to talk a wee bit about the past, a bit about the present, and a bit about the future. The past, because it's important to get a sense of where we started from, what was the rationale behind the thinking that led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament Education Service a way back in 1999. The present, that context that the Deputy Presiding Officer has described, which, as we know, is what gets you up in the morning as modern studies teachers, that dynamic environment, but also presents challenges, as we know. And then I'm also going to pose a bit of a challenge for the future. Given the present context and some of the trends that we know are happening around politics and education, what can the modern studies community do to take us forward for the next 20 years? And obviously in my workshop this morning and this afternoon I'll say a wee bit more about these things, but this is very much the workshop is the director's cut where I'm allowed to expand on some of these things. This is going to be the trimmed down edit. So in terms of the history of the education service, for me personally, it was just an incredible time to be involved in something like that. I left school in North Lanarkshire on the Friday, and I started actually in the Scottish office, because the Parliament didn't even exist at the time, on the Monday. So it was quite a transition from school on the Friday to civil servant on the Monday morning. No bells, a wee bit of time to think, which was really appreciated, and I suspect many of you don't actually get. A bit of a blank sheet of paper, and I'll say more about how the blank sheet of paper began to be filled in. And perhaps the most mundane but important thing of all was that I could have comfort breaks at a time of my own convenience, which was genuinely revelatory for me. The period between when I started in January 1999 up until May in the first election was really frantic, and I've just been reading the book recently, 20 Years of the Scottish Parliament, and a lot of contributions from that are people who were part of the parliamentary staff at the time. And it was incredibly exciting but very challenging. We had to essentially create a parliamentary infrastructure in the space of about 4 or 5 months. And my responsibility was to create an education service that would meet the needs of the educators of Scotland in the space of those 4 or 5 months. We had a very small team. Initially it was just myself, then I was joined by 3 colleagues. But the demand for information about the Parliament and visits and so on was huge. So we turned around quite a lot of that in a very quick period of time. We got a website up and running, which if you were to look at it nowadays, it would look extremely primitive, but we were amazed. It was state of the art at the time. We created the election wall charts that are still there, and the design hasn't changed very much, albeit that the electoral map has shifted quite radically over the last 20 years. The visits programme itself that many of you, I'm sure, will have benefited from, I hope. And then also over the following months and years, we established a couple of really important precedents where we involved young people very much in the work of the Parliament. I had to fight a bit of a battle, it has to be said, to get young people into the chamber. at the time, but that was a really important principle. And a lot of the work that we did was informed by a really important, a number of important frameworks. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, Article 12, the idea that young people should be consulted and involved in decision-making, that was a really important influence on the spirit and the principles of the Education Service. There was also the Crick and Miller report in 1995 to make the Scottish Parliament a model for democracy. The Crick report in the English education system establishing the idea of education for citizenship. All of these things were really important in the background, but then the critical one was the Consultative Steering Group report, which came out, it was perfect time, and it came out, I think, about a month after I'd started, and that set out the principles of openness, accessibility, participation and accountability. And that really gave me the ammunition that I needed to persuade some people that young people had to play their part in the Parliament and to be visible, to be part of the public galleries and so on. Of course, bearing in mind all of this happened in the temporary accommodation up in the High Street rather than this rather splendid building. One of the other influences was looking at how other parliaments did that kind of work, the idea of educational visits and so on. We went to Westminster, where at the time it didn't really feel as if there was a model there that we would want to emulate. It was very much don't touch, this is a historic museum, a mausoleum of democracy, and that's possibly unfair, but that was the perception. And so we were trying to do something quite different here. The Swedish Parliament, we went to visit the Swedish Parliament, and they, as is typically Scandinavian, were, I think, very well ahead of us in the UK. Young people, it was just accepted that young people were part of the deliberations of the Parliament and were free to go into the chamber and to use it. The other influence, of course, was the Modern Studies curriculum. That was the starting point for much of the resource that we produced, and the MSA, again, were excellent partners in those early days. But it's important also to recognise that I had to look at the primary curriculum, 5 to 14 at the time, because there was a huge interest amongst primary school teachers and pupils in the work of the Parliament as well. And when I did the early analysis, it was about 60% primary schools in the first couple of years and 40% secondary schools that came to visit. And what were we trying to achieve when we started then? It was about increasing the knowledge about the Parliament. It was a new thing that we had to explain to the public as well as to young people. But more importantly, it was about trying to set an agenda where young people would be involved and would participate in the political process, that Parliament would be demystified, and that the political process itself would be opened up to young people. I left in 2001 to take up my post at Glasgow University, but I suppose the pace of change and curriculum and all the policy stuff never went away. In 2000 and 2002, Learning and Teaching Scotland, as was, published documents about education for citizenship, which were very much grounded in the idea of having a parliament and the need to educate about it. We had How Good is Our School Citizenship? I don't know if any of you have seen that document, but that was published in 2004. It's actually still got a lot of relevance, I would say. Curriculum for Excellence itself, of course, has responsible citizens as one of the 4 capacities. Learning for Sustainability, which came out in 2012. And crucially, I hope crucially in that document, it talked for the first time about an entitlement towards learning for sustainability, which also included citizenship and political literacy. The GTCS standards began to take account of sustainability. The standards for leadership talk about the need for head teachers and senior leaders to be politically aware. And then we've had the referendum and the political literacy briefing. And the latest Curriculum for Excellence Refresh, again, reasserts the importance of aspects of citizenship. So I suppose what I'm saying in all of that is that the policy has kept pace, I think, on paper, with all of the changes that have happened in Scottish democracy. But of course, one of the questions, and I'll explore it more in the workshop, is the extent to which that has translated into classroom teaching and learning. And I think it has to some extent, but perhaps not fully. And then we've had the more recent developments, the independence referendum, the EU referendum, Brexit, all of the the dynamism in that, the excitement around increased participation, around the turnout rate for the Scottish independence referendum in particular, votes at 16, and yet at the same time a deterioration in the public discourse around politics, the pressure on elected members now, which I think is especially acute at Westminster, is concerning. And in the meantime, young people who may or may not be receiving, I'm talking globally here, who may or may not be receiving a political literacy entitlement in their schools, are taking action for themselves. They're not waiting, they're going on strike, inspired by Greta Thunberg. And so there's a very dynamic global context, but one that's also full of concern around illicit political communication, influence and manipulation. And again, Kate might refer to some of that later on, and that rise in authoritarianism and populism. As well as trying not to be too nostalgic, also swore I wouldn't use the T word today. Just suffice to say that my recent modern studies students would talk about a certain person as being the gift that keeps giving in the classroom, because whatever else you might say about the President, there's never a dull moment in terms of modern studies and using exemplification around the Constitution and so on. Another area of concern, and this is based on some research that I'll go into in a bit more detail in the workshop, but it's from the Journal of Democracy, July 2016, by Foa and Munk. I don't know if any of you would have seen this research at the time, but essentially what it was saying was that people's attitudes to democracy vary by age quite considerably. For example, if you were born in Europe in the 1930s, 74% of respondents felt that it was essential to live in a country that is governed democratically. The same figure, the figure for people born in the 1980s, younger people, was that only 42% thought it was essential to live in a democracy. And there are some other quite concerning findings from that research. So that takes us into the space to look at the future. And as modern studies teachers, I'm always absolutely empathetic with the challenge of staying up to date with everything that is going on in the world. But maybe we need to rethink the role of the modern studies teacher to some extent. In a knowledge-rich environment where if they have their smartphones in your classroom, all the knowledge is there at their fingertips. If they want to know what the turnout rate was in the 1974 February general election, they can get that. And I know that modern studies teachers do much more than that. But it's about curating that knowledge for them. I think there's a role for modern studies in promoting voter registration. And again, I know many of you will be involved in that agenda. But that should actually be at the core of what we do, and including the Votes at 16 agenda. I think some of it is about channeling the righteous anger of young people in positive directions. When they look around and see the state of the world, I think increasingly they're not putting up with this idea that, well, young people will sort that out. And you defer the responsibility for environmental catastrophe to the next generation. They're actually saying, and that's one of the really interesting messages that's coming across from young people, is, well, no, actually, it's not us that have caused this. It's you, as in the adults. So channeling that anger and showing that there are still ways for political influence around that. There's also that thing about modern studies as a space for fostering civilised discourse. Now, I know that some modern studies classrooms, when you get onto some particular topics, it's quite hard to maintain the civil discourse when they get very wound up. But that's part of it. I think it's important to feed that into the wider world, where we're saying that, yes, we can disagree with other people's opinions, but trying to do that in a civilised manner and setting the tone is really important. And it's also, in closing, it's about supporting the development of political literacy, but perhaps thinking about political literacy maybe in a broader sense. For me, political literacy is about the obvious things around structures and processes, how a bill becomes law, the powers between the Scottish Parliament and Westminster and so on. But it's also about critical literacy around language, interpretation of language, deciphering political language, It's about media literacy, looking at new media, big data, surveillance that's going on, and the manipulation and use of algorithms in social media that many people are unaware of. It's also, and I was hesitating to use this phrase, but epistemic literacy, I think, is part of the political literacy that we should be teaching in our schools. And again, I know many of you will be doing this. You might not call it that, but it's about the validity of truth claims in a post-truth environment politically, helping young people to understand what constitutes truth and fact rather than opinion has never been more important. And I think there's also something about ethical literacy, remembering that at its best, politics is based on values, it's based on an understanding of right and wrong. And again, I know that modern studies teachers do this day to day in their classroom, but what it sometimes needs is for you to step back. As I say, that privilege that I had when I first started at the Parliament 20 years ago, of stepping back and having a wee think about what I was trying to achieve. I think it's important for modern studies teachers to get that space, and I know you don't often get it, but perhaps today's a chance for you to think about, right, what is it that we're actually trying to do here? The world has changed in the last 20 years, often for the better, but sometimes for the worse in the political sphere. So how can you contribute to taking us forward for the next 20 years? Thank you.
Thank you, and your comments about what is true and what is not true is a good link, I think, to Dr. Britton. I'd like to invite, thank you, Dr. to Dr. Dommett. I'd like to invite Kate Dommett, Senior Lecturer, Director of the Crick Centre for Public Understanding of Politics at University, to speak. Dr. Dommett's current research is focused on the use of data in campaigns and the consequences of online campaigning techniques on citizens. She's also undertaking experimental research designed to look at the effect of online advertising badging to generate new insights pertinent to the debate around digital imprints. I don't quite know what that means. You'll need to explain that to me. I don't know. I've maybe been digitally imprinted. I don't know, but you can tell me. Over the last year, Dr. Dommett has provided oral evidence to the All-Parliamentary Group on Electoral Campaigning Transparency and written evidence for the Department of Culture, Media and Sport Committee inquiry into fake news, very topical, the Electoral Commission's consultation on codes of conduct and the Cabinet Office's consultation on protecting the debate. Dr. Dommett, please. I'm expecting you to explain this digital imprinting thing to me.
Goodness, well, it's all about elections.
Oh, that's for me, that's for me.
Yes, my diary's just got a lot busier at the moment, thanks to the calling of an election. Well, first off, I'd like to say thank you ever so much for the invite. It's a real honour to be able to come and speak to you today. It's also very nice to be in quite a different parliament. At the moment, I'm working with the House of Lords on the committee that has just been established on democracy and digital technology. And what I'm going to hopefully speak to you about today is really focusing on that idea of digital technology and how it's maybe going to be affecting how we're thinking about citizenship and the skills that we want to pass on to young people. And I'm also kind of here as director of the Crick Centre. So Bernard Crick obviously is founding influencer in terms of establishing citizenship education in the UK. And what we're trying to do within the research centre that I'm now leading is thinking about how do we need to redefine those citizenship skills for the 21st century. So I'm going to focus on those things today. And I think one of the things that has been particularly interesting in preparing for this talk is that within the committee that I'm helping to run at the moment in the House of Parliament, they're concerned with a whole range of really diverse impacts of digital technology on society as a whole, but particularly on electoral politics. So it's a huge, expansive inquiry, but one of the recurring things that keeps coming up as a solution to all the radical changes that we're seeing in society today as affected by digital technology is this idea of digital literacy, is about the importance of citizenship education for young people. And for me, that's really fascinating because it's seen as a solution to such a wide range of problems. But I think actually trying to pin down, well, what does that look like and what does that mean, is a really, really important question, and it's something that will affect the kind of day-to-day work that you're all actually doing in working with young people. So what I'm going to do is talk about two different stories around the impact that digital technology is having on society. And I'm going to specifically try and relate those to kind of two themes that I know are covered within the curriculum. So that's around political debate and political participation. And I think these are interesting areas, because political debate, it's all about how we speak about politics, how we gather information, and how we behave with one another as citizens within a common society. And political participation is such a fundamental democratic value. It's really tied to our expectations of what it is to be a citizen in politics, and is routinely seen to be under threat by falling and lower levels of participation, and questions about the validity of different forms of participation, the best way of getting involved and expressing your voice. And I think when we think about political debate and political participation, we've tended to tell two very different stories about the impacts of digital technology on these two things. And I think these two stories are interesting because they affect how we conceive of the impact of digital, and they affect what kind of education and what kind of skills that we would need to equip not just actually young people, but citizens throughout society to gain and to promote in order to be able to actively thrive in these different environments. And I don't think we're often very good at acknowledging these two different stories and thinking about how our understanding of digital and its effect on society might be affecting the practices and the kind of things we think that we need to teach. So I'm going to talk through them and then at the end kind of discuss about how this might affect the kind of teaching that you want to be doing with young people. So the first story that I want to start with is a story of optimism, a story of the sunny uplands, and about how digital technology is going to have such a fundamentally fantastic impact upon our society. Now, this is the story that within academia, when digital technology started to emerge, this is what we all grabbed onto. And the early scholarship all around digital technology, how it's going to affect political participation, how it's going to change society, is very, very optimistic. And it's kind of emerged around the 2000s, and we kind of saw it for a good decade. We saw it as a really powerful force for change. And we also, as a UK, as a nation, we saw ourselves as real digital leaders, as we were going to grab this technology and really use it for our purposes and to bring about positive change. And it was seen to unlock a lot of unfulfilled potential that hadn't previously been able to be maximised. So when we think about that in terms of political debate, digital technology was seen to democratise public discourse. It was seen to provide a really important supplement to existing offline channels through which citizens could come together and to quite fundamentally transform them. So if you think about things like social media or YouTube, these platforms were places where people could come together, they could talk, you suddenly had new opportunities to publish your views online and to gain feedback on them. And all of these opportunities to meet people from different perspectives and encounter different ideas, kind of distinct from those traditional media channels. So it's a huge new array of voices, and that was seen to really enrich public debate in a way that we hadn't seen before. And it was particularly seen to be valuable within academic discourse because suddenly it was allowing a channel for people who hadn't had the opportunity to have their voice heard, could actually break through and gain coverage of their views. So if you think about the statistics on kind of gender breakdown of those people who feature in the news or who are active within politics, then this was a whole new sphere in which a different range of people could come together and have their views heard. It was also seen to allow a different kind of public debate. So there's been an awful lot of emphasis about the potential of digital technology to allow public deliberation and to allow people to come together to learn about different ideas, be exposed to different perspectives, and to engage and discuss in a really constructive way. And you can find some fascinating studies around this, and I think there are some really good stories to tell here. So there's a piece of technology, for example, called Polis, which allows citizens to register. You can sign up, create an account. The way it's used is to try and create consensus amongst very diverse and divided communities. So it was quite famously used in Taiwan, where they were really struggling to come up with a policy about how to regulate taxi driving within the city. And the legislative process had failed. There just wasn't a solution to be found. And what they did is they got citizens to come in, and the way it works is you write a kind of statement about what you think should happen, and then other people can vote it up or down if they agree or disagree. But it then encourages people to write more consensual statements that help to bring people together. And through this process, they were actually able to form a law that brought about change and resolved an issue that previously wasn't able to be resolved. And I think that example was really embraced by people as an illustration of the potential of digital technology. You could really see how it could bring about a different kind of public debate that was less adversarial. And I think, for me, these examples around political debate and how digital technology can be used in an interesting way are fascinating because they have kind of implications for how we might be teaching our young people to engage online. So if you have a positive view of democracy and about how digital can enable public debate, then the kind of skills that you're going to focus on are, at one hand, just quite technical. You know, how do you actually understand and navigate these digital spaces? How do you sign up for different profiles and engage in these public debates, and where might you want to go? They're focused on kind of discoverability, about familiarising yourself with platforms, and about the skills that you need online. So often, you know, we really see this digital literacy and these kind of ideas fall into understandings about computational skills and about, you know, IT competencies. But they also inspire a different kind of focus on what skills young people and indeed adults, because it's not just young people here, but it's about, you know, if you have a positive view of how digital affects public debate, then it's encouraging people to voice their opinion, to get involved. It's about creating expectations of how you should behave online. But overwhelmingly, it's quite a positive vision of something that we should be doing that can bring about change, and that we should invest and really encourage people to get involved online. And I think we do see a lot of that within the kind of guidance that is put out for civic education training in different countries around the world, a real focus on skills and confidence. But that then kind of brings me to the second aspect, this kind of participatory aspect. It's not just debate, but it was also, digital technology was also seen in quite a positive way as these spaces for participation, because they did open up this whole new realm in which you could get involved. It was lowering the costs of engagement. We had talk about kind of micro acts of participation and your ability to no longer have to kind of sign up for party membership or turn up to meetings on a dry, grizzly evening. You could just kind of turn on your computer and engage online. And in terms of how that's transformed into education, like similarly, it's quite functional. We're seeing a real emphasis on skills, encouraging people to get online and to engage in different spaces. But the other side of the story that has begun to emerge in this second understanding of digital technology paints a really different picture about what's going on online and about the kind of practices that we see in public debate and participation, and therefore what we might want to educate our young people to do. And that story, for me, has emerged particularly prominently since around 2015. So Alan was talking about, you know, the rise of fake news, misinformation, deep fakes. So these are kind of examples of videos that are produced using AI technology. So you can edit a video so that it looks like someone is saying something they're not, and they are very, very difficult for the human eye to detect. So a whole new depth of fake news, essentially. Makes it very, very hard to navigate the information landscape and work out what is true and what isn't true. We've also seen a real focus and real concern around polarization online, around, although the evidence of filter bubbles is actually fairly limited, the evidence is more routine that people are being polarized, that they are engaging with more extreme content as well. There's been some really concerning research done about how YouTube pre-rolls and the fact it just kind of links you onto the next YouTube video. It drives you to more and more extreme content. And there have been some very, very concerning studies about polarisation and this kind of extremism, and how people are really encouraged to express their views to the very extremes online. There's also been real concerns around the impact of digital technology and political debate in terms of actually undermining quite an established democratic value about the fact that political debate and engagement should be something that's common across the whole of society. And what we're seeing through targeting, especially online, especially using advertising, and it's something that we'll see at this election in the UK upcoming, like very targeted political advertising, is actually really segmenting the population. So we're no longer getting a message that everyone sees through the party political broadcast, for example, on the TV. It is now possible for political actors to use targeting to offer different messages to different voters. And this isn't just an electoral thing, this can happen outside of electoral politics, it's much wider. But we're seeing that this idea of public debate is being quite fundamentally changed online, and you might be seeing a very different picture to the image that someone else is getting. And then something else that Alan also referred to, we've seen real concern around the rise of bullying, online abuse, with truly terrible consequences, especially on social media, which is something that young people have to deal with every day. So essentially, we've got a very, very different story about how public debate is being affected by digital technology, and it's raising a lot of concerns. We similarly have concerns about participation and how digital is affecting that. So there is increasing evidence of unequal levels of participation online. There have been stories of online platforms being used to suppress the voter turnout of certain groups. So in the US, there was a lot of efforts to target messaging at ethnic minority groups to give them wrong information about when to turn out or what they needed to do to vote. And there's also been this real growing recognition that actually participation online carries a really high risk, especially if you're from minority groups. Kind of putting your voice out there and taking action online can expose you to an awful lot of abuse, as Greta Thunberg has found out to her cost. Now, these trends have real implications for how we then think about the skills that we're teaching online. So rather than empowering people and just giving them the skills to log on in that positive vision, I think it leads us to be far more cautious and concerned about what we need to skill our young people to do. That is about developing skills in terms of how you navigate and understand information. It's about understanding the risks online and taking quite conscious decisions about what it is and isn't appropriate to take. So it's a very different vision of what we actually need to be educating our young people to do in the digital sphere. And to kind of bring these points together, I think at the moment, I don't think that we actually often acknowledge these two different visions and think about their implications for how we're teaching. I think as a cohort of people who are directly delivering this kind of training to young people, it's important to think about that kind of cohesive range of skills that young people need, and to recognise both the positive and the negative outcomes that engaging through digital platforms can have on young people's lives. I think I'm not a doom monger. I do think a lot of good things can come out of this, but we've got to acknowledge the risks that are also present with the advantages. And I think one interesting thing that I keep coming back to is this idea that potentially, rather than just teaching people about processes and content and skills, there's got to be an increased emphasis on kind of criticality. And I think, as you were saying, this kind of epistemic skills, how do you navigate such a complex and diverse and changing landscape? But I want to kind of end by saying that I don't think we should put all the emphasis on you as educators and teachers. These trends are raising huge questions, which it's vital for policymakers and parliamentarians to actually think about and legislate on, because a lot of the implications that young people are being exposed to through digital could be changed and challenged by policymakers. It could be possible, for example, to force online platforms to be designed in a different way so that they actually promote positive forms of engagement rather than encouraging negative outcomes. So I think digital literacy and education is such a vital part of how we're going to need to tackle the trends that we're witnessing. But for me, it shouldn't be everything. And I think part of that, lobbying for change and bringing about those broader shifts, is going to be really critical for young people being able to navigate democracy today. I'll leave it there.
I was sitting here reflecting on the changes as a campaigning politician from 20 years ago to today, when constituents got in touch with letters. They don't now, it's emails. It doesn't matter what age. Now, if I ask for their email address, they have it. They're on the internet, they have text, they have mobile phones, they're not on a landline. And I think the issues that you raised, Doctor, about the communications between politicians and the public, and also the information that's out there, is very tricky stuff. It's a real Pandora's box for both politicians and the electorate. To understand what's being said and if it's being said appropriately. I have to say myself, I have a business Facebook, but I don't tweet. I've decided it's a danger zone, and I think I'm glad. So I don't know what nasty things people are saying about me. They can keep saying it because it's behind my back, and that's where it's going to stay. Now, I'm going to move on to a question and answer session. I'm sure you have really interesting stuff from both speakers, to the keynote speakers. So in a moment, I'm going to ask Dr. Britton and Dr. Dominic to join me down in the well of the chamber, but I want to just explain. We've got about 30 minutes for a question and answer session. So if you could keep your comments and questions as brief. I'm known to tell people to get to their question quickly, but I won't be rude to you today because you're nice people. You're not MSPs. And so it lets as many people in as possible. If you have a question, what to do is to just raise your hand, and if you're selected and I'll call you, what will happen is the red light in your microphone will come on in front of you. But there's also a handheld one. Somebody's swanning about somewhere. Where are they? There we are. Thank you. Hello. To come up and that if you do ask a question, it'd be quite good if you wish to identify yourself and your school, if you wish, and so everybody in the chamber can hear your question. Okay, so we'll just have a slight break, stretch our legs for 2 seconds while we get down there. Thank you very much. Now, teachers are always wanting pupils to ask questions and looking for hands to be put up, so I don't want any people modesty or shyness here. You should all be ready to go. So first question, please. Oh, I'll tell your pupils about this. I'll tell them. No, come on. Let's get a question. Thank you very much. Has the microphone come on yet?
No, it's not. But
there you go. Just stand up. Say your name, please.
All right, it's on now. I'm Derek, and I'm from Greenfields High School in Cumbernauld. So you'd made a number of points about the sort of confidence and the challenge that social media has allowed people, the democratisation of the media. Would you say that the mainstream media, the reason that people are going to those platforms is actually because they don't trust the mainstream media? So, you know, the BBC would be a prime example in Scotland. You know, the viewer numbers are dramatically reduced, particularly since 2014. And even in my times as teaching now, we would now teach that the BBC is not always neutral, that it can actually be biased, and there's plenty of evidence of that. So would you say that basically the trust, the mainstream media, as they try and hold on to the readerships, the viewerships, that actually they narrow the debate and actually forces people online to the sort of more dangerous extremist elements that are out there?
You want to answer that? You're nodding. You're nodding.
No, I think that's a really good point. And so I am pretty sure that someone will have done a study about trust in the BBC. But the work that I am aware of, and there has been some really interesting research, which is showing that people do kind of they start not trusting mainstream sources, and then they start going online, and you can suddenly access material which kind of confirms your views a lot more, and it's very, very attractive. And I think a lot of people are very suspicious of kind of establishment sources, and therefore look online for trusted sources that they can engage with because of shared views. And there are some kind of there've been some quite interesting work that's been looking at how people are really attracted to like-minded communities and end up investing an awful lot. And I think sometimes that can lead to negative outcomes in terms of this kind of radicalisation and extremism of people, but it can also be very positive. So there's an initiative based in London, I believe called Shout Out UK, where kind of young people come together and they actually write their own version of the news stories, and they try and make the young people's perspective come across in politics. And so it can actually be quite a positive thing, and maybe pointing out the fact that news outlets like the BBC maybe don't always think about the perspective of different groups, and so therefore you need other channels to express those ideas.
Do you want to make a... No, right. Anybody else? Come on. Got to be an early tea, as they say. Yes. Yes.
Is the Taiwanese example...
Identify yourself, please.
Is that okay? Yeah.
No, just say who you are for everybody. Again.
Is the Taiwanese...
No, your name.
Oh, sorry, my name. Beg your pardon. Name's Gordon Black.
I'll need to get... Right, off we go again.
From Dundee, okay? Is the Taiwanese example something that may be used to heal UK, if we're still in the European Union, if we're out after Brexit? Mm-hmm.
It has been used in the UK. It's weird, but it's often used by businesses. So, for example, I know that my university is currently running a consultation using pretty much exactly the same software to try and come up with a corporate plan. So it is being used. There are some interesting new trials. So there is a new think tank that's been created called Britton that is promoting online deliberation. And their objective is to foster debates around very controversial and difficult issues. I know they're starting with climate change, and I know they want to go on to Brexit. So trying to bring people together online. So I do think that there is a lot of potential. And online platforms are great, but also offline, there have been repeated calls for a citizens' assembly around Brexit, which would physically bring people with different perspectives together to debate. So I think it could be an interesting way forward.
Could I maybe
just jump in
slightly to that in relation to the notion of civic engagement and the desire to create new forms of civic engagement. And I remember, in the early days of the Parliament, we had the Civic Forum, which was set up at more or less the same time as the Parliament in 1999. The Civic Forum was a pre-digital version of that, where civic society in Scotland was supposed to come together and deliberate and to feed into the legislative process, to the policy process. But interestingly, it ran out of steam after a couple of years. But there is also a concern that when you create these opportunities, they aren't necessarily inclusive. That what you might find is that you attract the same categories of people who are always engaging anyway. The deeper issue that I don't think we've ever resolved is how to widen political participation to the harder to reach categories of citizens as well. So I think it's part of the answer, but we have to continue to think creatively about ensuring that engagement reaches everyone.
I want to add, I'm not the panel, but I'll add a couple of things to it. The Citizens' Assembly has been established now by this government to try and widen the catchment for what Scotland should be doing, the direction of Scotland across. It's apolitical. It sets out as that. Secondly, we have the Youth Parliament, which I know, again, it tends to be people who nominate themselves to some extent, but that's an endeavour. We've also got the schools that come in here, primary and secondary, been coming in here for a long time, and they ask very pertinent questions. And in fact, the primary children are really informed about what this Parliament can and can't do, and their ideas for things. We also have a Petitions Committee. It's a mandatory committee here, and anyone can submit a petition. It can be, there's no age range for it, and there's no number that must sign it. And that petition can grow and change legislation and policy. And some big policy changes here have come about through very ordinary people bringing forward petitions. So they're not just campaigning, collecting signatures, and they're just getting delivered to a doorstep at number 10. I know they've now got petitions there, but they used to just go to number 10, photo op, and off we went. Not here. Since 1999 petitions, in fact, the railway in my constituency, the Borders Railway, came because of a 17,000 signature petition. It's a people's railway. I also have to say in this Parliament, again, it's the usual suspects that tend to come before committees, but you know, the consultations are wide. Before the government announces, whichever government announces any legislation, they consult. And then when it gets put to a committee, they put it out again to ask people. So, you know, there's huge efforts made here to try and make sure that people are aware of what's happening. And of course, with minority governments in here, no, they've just had one in UK for the first time, the government can't get away with just driving stuff through here. You know, so if people approach other parties and say, I'm not happy about this and so on, how can that legislation be changed? Amendments can happen to bills and the government's made to change. So you're sitting in a parliament that was designed not to have a majority, an overall majority. So it means there has to be negotiation a lot of the time about what happens, making the power of outside interest greater. That, you know, once you're elected here, you can't just sit in your laurels. On top of which, last thing I'll say is that because we have a sort of proportional representation, I represent a constituency, but there's 6 other MSPs breathing down my neck who are on the regional list who can also cover matters in my constituency. So as a result, I have to be on my toes representing. I can't just sit, you know, I've been elected for 5 years, thank you very much. For a politician, you have to pay attention to the needs of your constituents individually and collectively, simply for the reason there's other people waiting to take your seat, and they're working at it for the 5 years that you're there. These are all good things. So I have to say, not perfect, but you know, I think the engagement here is, we've tried very hard to extend, and also the committees themselves go out. I chair the health committee, went to Glasgow, and there was a big hoo-ha about what was happening to one of the local hospitals, quite rightly. Well, we were right in front of them, we were in the firing line. You know, so they got a real chance to have a go at us and to put their views. So I think, you know, to put all that into context, by no means are we perfect, but we have certainly tried. In fairness to Westminster, we started with a clean sheet. We didn't have all this historic, you know, clutter around us and all this rubbish about special outfits and, I don't know, going out to vote down corridors and all that. We press buttons, you know, we're modern here. This is Scotland after all. But you know what I'm saying is we've tried. We were lucky. We had a blank piece of paper to some extent. We could have a different electoral system. We have a different representation in here, and our committees work differently because our committees are both select and standing. In other words, they don't just deal with legislation, they deal with inquiries, the two together. It's not the same at Westminster. So that, I think, makes for greater engagement. Now, I'm only saying all this to fill in time, by the way, because I'm waiting for hands to go up. Thank you. There you go. Yes, there's somebody down here. Put your wave. There he is. See, is the light on? Is your light on?
Sorry.
Excellent.
Thomas Taylor, Courtness High School. I think we can all agree that it's important that civic engagement and being involved in politics and having your pupils be engaged in politics is something that's really, really important. And it's important that they do it in a civil manner. I kind of always have kids challenging opinions as opposed to the person giving it. But how does the panel feel about our ability to do that when you could argue that the politicians that are quite prominent within politics aren't actually civilly engaging themselves? I find it quite difficult to say to a fourth-year class to not challenge each other based on things that aren't their opinions when you've got the President of the United States giving people abuse on Twitter and basically the British politicians not doing much better.
Do you want to start?
I do remember, not in, as I said before, in this chamber, but in the old chamber up in the High Street, the shock of a lot of the visiting school groups at the behaviour of the MSPs. Now, this was, and this is the challenge, I suppose, that you can do everything. The design of the chamber up the road, some of you will remember, it was very similar to this. They tried to make it semicircular, reduce the confrontational element, and still politicians have to be politicians. So they would come out, and the young people would sit behaving impeccably, and then they would come out afterwards and they would be really often quite upset. And that would be some of the questions that they would ask the elected members who would come along to meet with the groups. But part of the problem, of course, is that you would rarely get a school group visiting a committee session in here. But if they went into a committee session and saw the way in which the MSPs work across party lines and quietly get on with the business of actually conducting inquiries and scrutinising legislation, you would see something very different. And of course, that's a wider problem, that the media only ever covers the theatre of First Minister's questions in here or Prime Minister's questions at Westminster. And of course, they amplify the more extreme forms of political behaviour. And I think that's unfortunate, because it just feeds into a narrative which ignores the work that MPs and MSPs do in constituencies, the quiet work of going on, irrespective of party, to make people's lives better in their constituency. That story isn't really told, other than, I would suggest, in modern studies classrooms. So the wider public doesn't know that. I think there is an issue there about, you educate people about the realities of the political system, but for many adults who were not fortunate enough to get modern studies as part of their education are missing out on that.
I fully endorse that.
I have to say, that's absolutely right about committees. And it's also right outside the chamber, because we are people. And things happen in our lives, and when something happens in another politician's life, there's a sadness that happens of one kind or the other. We all come together and support them. We have no idea. It's a completely different thing in the tea room or, out in the corridors. But there is a role for the presiding officer, which is, I'm one of them, and that is, I don't like them to play the man or the woman and not the ball, as they say at football. That's the only footballing metaphor I know. And if somebody uses, we don't have unparliamentary language, but if somebody says something, in my gut, I don't like it, I stop them, press my button and say, I'm sure you can rephrase that. And then if they don't, I'll say, well, I think you should sit down. And they do, believe you me, they sit down. There are ways of dealing with them if they're naughty that they don't even know, and I'm not telling you because they work. But I think if you let it descend into somebody name-calling, it's passion, yes. Passion, and sometimes passion gets them carried away. You must let them have a little bit of passion and a little bit of steam. But once it gets into name-calling, then you descend into the playground, the worst of the playground, and I don't like that. And like many teachers in here, you know when it's just slipping. Something happens and you think, I'm going to nip this in the bud before it develops any arms and legs. And like any good school teacher, you're hard on them at the beginning, and then you maybe ease off a little bit later on, but you can't do it the other way round. And see, many of them didn't know I'd been a secondary teacher for 12 years, because I was a lawyer after that. They found out pretty quickly. But there is a role for the presiding officer in maintaining, this is a parliament. People don't like to see, I don't like to see people being horrible to each other. Yes, attack their politics, but not the person. So there's a role also for us in the chair, and we do use it, and we use it, and we make sure we discuss afterwards. The three of us will meet together and discuss whether or not we feel somebody has overstepped the mark and what we're going to do about it. A bit like the staff room. See, it always happens as you go towards the end. That if I say we're about to stop in 5 minutes, there'll be a flurry of hands. Yes, so see, look at that now, I'll get 3. So I'll give you numbers so that I know where I'm going. So that's 1, 2, 3. Number 1, please. Is your light on? Just wait.
Yeah, no, it is. Oh, wow. I'm Courtney from Grove Academy in Dundee. Just in regards to citizenship and engagement, how do we promote global citizenship and civic engagement with countries who may limit their own citizens' rights, in your opinion?
Well,
Goodness, what a question.
she's aghast at that one, but well, did you want to think about it or come right in? Or?
You have to give me a moment to think about it.
Right,
That's really interesting.
Right.
I'm going to ask for a clarification. Are
Well, you could go to
talking
Taiwan
about
for a
topics like
start.
China or...?
I mean, that's one example, yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, we know that in terms of the different countries that you study in modern studies, one of the big questions, I suppose, that I've been wrestling with since I started teaching modern studies long before the 20-year window that I've been talking about already. But, which countries do we study and why in the international topics? There has to be a rationale for that, and sometimes I think we lost sight of that. The rationale was we did those because we'd been doing them for a long time, and I think there's much more creativity now around the countries that are studied in international topics. But again, it's asking the question, why do we study that country? And sometimes we study them to bring together a historic perspective with a contemporary perspective. You know, you might do it, especially in the BGE, you're looking at a country so that you can bring together a social studies perspective on a country, and that's often a real interesting approach in the BGE. But sometimes you're studying, I think, as it's the equivalent of a warning from history. We can look at other countries, and if we just use China as an example, and the use of surveillance, AI, facial recognition that's happening, all this very contemporary stuff, well, that's a warning, I think. We study, yes, there's a political system there, but the interface between politics and technology in China just very recently is something that we have to look at, because it acts as a warning sign. It's, you know, the canary in the mine is that when politics and advanced technologies come together in an authoritarian context, it's extremely dangerous. So it acts to illustrate and you know, to clarify some of the concerns that we might have bubbling under the surface in our own approaches to that interface. So I think that it can absolutely be done and should be done.
I think that's like a fascinating question, actually. I've been sitting here thinking about it. It was a very good answer. I think, so something that I try to do with the teaching I do to like first-year undergraduates is like try and show the spectrum of different practices without judgment. So like I teach democracy, for example. So what we do is we kind of take a whole range of different countries and talk about what's common and what's different, and try not to go in with the presumption that the way that we do it is the correct way, but actually really encourage them to understand the spectrum of different ways, and then to think about which values matter most to them, and therefore where they might diverge or converge with other countries. And actually by doing that, we often find that they don't end up viewing what happens in the UK as the best standard, but you know, I think it prompts them to maybe rethink some of the assumptions that everything in the UK is great, but other countries are very problematic. And actually we can see that other countries are far more leading in certain areas than other areas. So I think by trying to move away from that presumption that we're getting everything right, because quite often we're not. Facial recognition, most football stadiums in the UK use that. You know, we do a lot of things that we're condemning elsewhere, but we don't like to necessarily own it.
Second questioner, who was that? Do you think you were served, by the way? Don't be naughty. Second questioner. Is it on?
Yes.
Yes, that's it now.
My name's Anne McMillan. I teach at Brannock High School in Motherwell in North Lanarkshire. I think I've really enjoyed what we've said this morning. I think we can definitely all agree that politics and sociology and technology and social media are now almost intrinsically linked together. But I was wondering what the panel's thoughts were on how we as citizens, and especially us as teachers, can encourage the young people to try and make it as much of a positive experience as possible. We've seen some pretty horrible things going on social media lately by numerous people in public office and otherwise, and I think young people get very disheartened by that. So I'm just wondering how we think we can encourage it to be a more positive experience.
I think it's just about encouraging them to like, be the change they want to see, you know, like, so it's very corny. But things like, you know, places like Twitter, awful because people troll one another. But there's been quite a recent movement of actually, if you see something positive, or if you see someone make a negative comment, then intervene and say something positive, and actually, you know, try and change the nature of the discourse that's happening online. It's very difficult, but I also think it is possible to then encourage young people to kind of curate the community that they want to be in online, and actually to take a kind of quite active role in thinking about what it is that they do want to see and what they don't want to see. And I think part of that is individual user experience, but part of it is us as a society pushing to make it much easier for us to be able to actually change the platforms in ways that we want to see. So, you know, for example, you should be able to curate your Facebook to look how you want to see it, not how someone in California has decided it should be looking. So it's about actually giving people much more power to be able to shape and define how these tools look.
Hi Anne, nice to see you again, a former student of mine. You're doing very well.
How do you rate your teacher there? Are you allowed to say?
And it was an excellent question, which I think, you know, Kate's obviously answered from a position of far greater knowledge in the digital domain. But what it prompts in my thinking, I was coming over on the train this morning, and I was, you know, my daughter's now 14, and she's reaching that point where I think she is becoming increasingly politically engaged. Fortunately, she's chosen modern studies at high school. But would I want her to go into politics? Or for that matter, my son, who's a bit younger? I have to say some of the accounts and the sheer numbers of MPs who are retiring early at this next UK general election is really concerning. So I think there is something profound. It's that point that I made earlier on. It's not all up. You know, you can't carry the can for all the issues. You know, global social media is extremely powerful, as we've seen. They resist every attempt at any form of regulation. But something has to give, I think, in terms of the algorithms, as Kate said earlier on, because they can adjust if put under sufficient pressure. I think there are things that can be done in the classroom, and I'm sure many of you are doing it already. But as I say, it can't just be for you to carry that. It has to be a whole society approach. But a huge responsibility. If we could just get that shift from them, for them to acknowledge that they are publishers of content, that would be a major step forward.
And the last question.
I wonder how...
Which school are
Oh,
you?
sorry. My name's James. I'm from Montrose Academy up in Angus. I wanted to ask, how much do you think your average MP or your average MSP gets the scale of the problem that the digital sphere is presenting? Because you clearly have these strange Goebbelian figures, your Dominic Cummings and your Steve Bannons, who are sort of popping up and latching onto a cause, and you know they all get it. But like, how much do you think the average politician understands it? I feel like maybe there's a lot of discussion about the decline in manners on Twitter or something like that, but there's maybe I just sort of feel like everyone's catching up on everything. The last huge election fix, the great hack, that kind of thing. Are people just chasing their tails? How well equipped do you think your average politician and backbencher is to cope with it?
I think that's a great question. It's kind of in two parts, my response. So I guess it's like some of the work I've been doing for the committee is actually looking at like the degree of like what all parliamentary committees in the UK have recommended in terms of what needs to change in digital. And it's quite startling there is a lot of consensus. And I think that politicians do recognise that there's a big challenge. They quite often feel quite overwhelmed about what's happening, and they want to see change and to bring that about. Now, interestingly, there's been very little action to actually do anything. And partly that might be because a lot of people within number 10 did quite well out of practices that we're now quite concerned about. So there's definitely a question about political motivation. But I think what you were also saying, and the kind of second part of what I want to say, is that we're chasing here. I think politicians and civil servants in the government departments that I speak to, they kind of they're playing whack-a-mole, essentially. They are seeing these difficulties happening, and they're trying to stop them. So digital imprints is about, so you have to have like information about who's printed and promoted a physical leaflet. You don't have to have that on any online content at the moment. So it's impossible to know who's saying what, who's funding what, and it's very, very untransparent. So there's a kind of, they're trying to roll out these changes to deal with issues that are kind of already happening. But I think the big picture work, thinking about actually, do we need a kind of digital champion within government who's actually taking that big picture? It's something I would love to see happen, is that we get politicians actually go, well, what do we want digital technology to look like, and how do we want digital technology to be used in society, and then define those principles, and then go to all the platforms, like go to different companies and saying you need to conform with our standards, rather than us try and react to the problems that are popping up because of your commercial practices. So I think they're aware, but I'm not sure that they are investing as much in leading the debate as they need to at the moment.
Anything I put out in the way of a report under the heading Christine Graham MSP is scrutinised by allowances. So it can't be party political, so that's important. However, what I put in Facebook is, for me, it's not the Parliament's Facebook, so there are lines there. In terms of something that's been alluded to about threats to politicians and so on, I touch wood, I don't think we've got quite the same problem in Scotland. It's certainly the First Minister has had, you know, terrible things said. And as I say, I keep away from Twitter because these things are hurtful. No matter who you are, you're still a person, and it's the hurtful things you remember in the dead of night, which you don't want to. But in terms of physical things, yes, I had somebody chasing me on emails that the police had to get involved with. This is a while back, who was delusional. They think they know you. I also have an office in Galashiels where I have 2 women in, and if there's not 2 women in, it's not open, even though it's got lots of security on it. I do my surgeries in public places, in supermarkets, but I sit next to services or something like that. That's all deliberate. And it's not always the fault of people who come to see you. Some have got really mental health problems. And, you know, it's not their fault. They get overexcited. They may start to look. I had an example of that in my early years. So you have to learn to behave in a certain way. I've had people shout things at me, and they don't know me. They think they know you because they've either seen you in the paper or on the television or something, and they think they know all about you, and they don't. But that's life. But I wouldn't want that to put anybody off going into politics, certainly none of the young women sitting in here, because the one cautionary thing I say is it's quite good to get experience of life before you come into politics, either in another. I've had 2 other careers, you don't need to do that, but I think it's quite useful to have done something first. But it's an extremely privileged job. I speak for all the MSPs, not speaking for my party or myself. It's extremely privileged. Most of the MSPs in here do a very hard and good job for their constituents and in the committees. So, you know, they get to do that, but so few of us get chosen to do it. And so I say to any young woman in particular, or anybody who's teaching who may want to come into politics, I came in after teaching, is to consider it if you feel you want to change things. But get some experience under your belt first of life, and it always helps. Dealing with individuals and dealing with problems. But there are things that happen now because of the internet. You just have to accept that. That's true. That happens to people, other people as well. Some of the issues we face will happen to GPs and nurses and bus drivers and shop assistants. You know, it's part of life now, I'm afraid. Goodness me, that's like a funeral speech. Anyway, on that thought, to say that it's actually a super job to have, can I just thank our panel and thank you for your questions. If you give them a round of applause, please. Now, I want to ask Gordon Black from the Modern Studies Educational Trust to speak. Mr. Black, lift our spirits after I've got everybody down there.
Morning all. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And again, good morning, colleagues. For anyone who hasn't been to conference before, you'll know that one of the kind of key highlight parts of the conference is definitely the award-making ceremony. And it's that capacity that I stand before you again this morning. As before, we have 2 awards to make. We have the highest achieving candidates at higher modern studies for 2019 and the highest achieving advanced higher candidate for modern studies for 2019. And I'm delighted that we have the families and the award winners with us this morning. Before I come to the actual handover of the trophies, and I'm going to ask the Deputy Presiding Officer if he should work with me on that, I would like to say a few words of thanks in advance, because these awards don't happen by themselves. We've got a number of people who I'm indebted to for putting them together. First of all, I have to say thank you to the SQA publicly. Without their cooperation, we would have no awards. I'd also like to thank the sponsors of the respective awards at Higher and Advanced Higher. That's Kirsty Work and Alan Clements, who personally sponsor the Higher Awards, and our friends at Hodder Education, who for a number of years have also sponsored the Advanced Higher Awards. So folks, who says education doesn't pay? Okay. Also, I would like to thank the families and the staff members who are here from the respective schools, all of which who have contributed and worked together in order that we can be here this morning. Now, the good bit is the awards themselves, okay? Many of you strive very hard, work throughout the year, you put your absolute best in, particularly in the senior school, okay? But that's enough about the teachers, okay? We're here to talk about you folk. Yeah, concentration, hard work, effort. There is no doubt that a higher modern studies or an advanced higher exam is a real ask, okay? A higher paper is 3 hours plus, your assignment. An advanced higher is also a 3-hour paper, okay, in total with a huge dissertation. So if you're doing advanced higher, you've got that to come, okay? Yeah, it's a big ask, okay, and any of the teachers here, if they were asked to undertake that, would find that a real challenge. Some of you may be young enough to remember that, okay, to do that, but for people of my age, Alan's age, yes, definitely, we're glad that we're quite a bit away from that end of the work. Yeah, it's a big ask. You folk, though, have excelled. All right. There isn't many people in life can say that they achieved 100% in the exams. It's a fantastic achievement. Commitment, hard work, dedication, all of that it takes to be a top candidate in Scotland. And I'm delighted on behalf of the Modern Studies community that we can have you along today to present you with the higher trophies so we can remember, and you can remember to be part of this presentation, something you can take forward, right, for your days afterwards. Okay. It really is a delight to have you here. You've done superbly well, and if I may, I would ask Deputy Presiding Officer to come up, and we'll take you one at a time and present you with your trophies. Okay? We will start. There are no particular order, folks. Okay? We have 3 higher award winners, and first up, I would like to ask Elizabeth Farr from St Andrews and St Bride's High School in South Lanarkshire, if you'd like to come forward.
There you go. Well done. Well done.
Now, I'll take that one back just momentarily. Okay. Right, okay. Yeah. Okay. You want to keep that one.
Quick award, wasn't it?
Right. Okay. Present the next one.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
Second award winner for hire, Rachel Kearney from George Heriot School here in Edinburgh. Okay. Rachel.
Is it the same trophy?
Same trophy. Yeah.
Well done. Well done. There you are. We'll do it here and you get your picture taken. Take it back again.
Yes, take it back again, please. Okay. Right.
You got to touch it. You got to touch it.
You will get a chance to hold it and to take a few more photographs after the presentation. And finally, and last but certainly no means least, can I ask Ria Banerjee from Hutchinson's Grammar in Glasgow if you would like to come forward as well, please.
Did I take it back again?
Yeah, you've got to take that
All
one.
right, all right.
You'll get a chance to see it later on.
It's not very often I do as I'm told.
Can I swap that, please, Christine?
Yes, you can.
With this one?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay, there is one award winner, okay, also 100%, in the Advanced Higher Modern Studies Trophy for 2019. Unfortunately, Olivia Cash from George Watson's College in Edinburgh can't be with us, but I'm delighted that Dad, Mike, has been prepared to come along. So just in case anybody thinks that they're taking in students who are looking a bit older, okay, no disrespect, Mike, okay, I'm delighted you come along on behalf of your daughter. Ladies and gentlemen, Mike Cash.
Well, let's have a picture of you here. I like this. Does he get to keep it? No. Nobody. It's a fun. Nobody gets to keep anything.
There is a
here.
small story I'll share later on about the trophies. But no, that concludes the presentation, folks. I would like to thank Christine again, the Deputy Presiding Officer, for being prepared to handle the trophies, and obviously once more, truly, families and friends, staff members, for pulling this all together. It is a highlight, it is a great occasion. Please remember it, enjoy it, and the rest of the conference, enjoy your day.
Thank you very much. Now, just before we conclude, can I ask the prize winners to come to the floor for a group photograph? You get to hold them again. It's a big excitement. So if you come over, please, just now. That's right. Come on. Give them a round of applause again. That's hard done, isn't it? Andrew, you take it from there. Right, we'll stand here. Come on. Dad's in and... What a show stealer, eh? What a show stealer. Oh, in the middle, right. Here we go. I do as I told them. Oh, is that it? Thank you. That's it. And can I invite Ruth Sharp now, from the MSA National Committee member, to give a vote of thanks. Ms Sharp, please.
First of all, just a couple of announcements from Hodder Gibson. Hodder Gibson will be running a CPD event for National 5 and for Higher, both in February. They've also got webinars organised for February as well for National 5 and Higher. You can get a 20% discount if you go to them and speak to about it today. So there's a wee incentive. You can also, if you fill in the form that you got in your registration packs, you can get a free book from Hodder Gibson. So just to make you aware of that. Moving on to the vote of thanks for the conference, I've really not done anything in terms of helping to organise this conference, but from previous years' experience, I'm acutely aware of how much work goes into a conference. First of all, I would like to thank Louise, who is our conference organiser. She's stepping down this year. This is the last conference she'll organise, but she has done quite a number of years. Yes. No backtracking, time for a break. She has done quite a number of years of work. It is a vast commitment when you're a full-time teacher and you're committing yourself to doing all these extra things over and above. So we really owe Louise a huge debt of thanks for that. I would also like to thank Scott, who had last year and this year revolutionised our delegate registration process with setting up and overseeing the Eventbrite booking system, which has really removed so much extra work from the committee, although he's then been landed with some extra work in the overseeing of that. But that's a really important job. To Jane West, who organises the stall holders, she's not actually able to be here herself today, but she's still involved in helping out in an awful lot of work behind the scenes organising the stall holders. To Jim, who is our chairperson, he's picked up a lot of extra jobs. If something else was needing done, then it went in his direction, so a big vote of thanks to him for that. To Gordon for all the work that he does with MSET across the year and for organising for our prize giving to the students today, which is always a highlight of the conference to recognise that national success. I'd also like to thank the Parliament staff for their work in organising the day and organising the programme for the day. We very much appreciate all the work that they put into it. I would like to thank the Deputy Presiding Officer for her work in chairing the events this morning, and to thank the speakers who have already spoken, to Kate and to David, and to thank all the people that are presenting at the workshops across the day. To wrap up then, I'll just say that I hope that you enjoy the rest of the day. It's a great opportunity to come together as modern studies teachers, to learn from each other and have this opportunity to enhance our professional learning. Thank you.
Well, that's it. Now you're going on, I understand, to your various workshops, and the events officers will guide you to those. So where are they? Are you about the place? Put your hands up. Don't know where you are. Events officers. Oh, there you go. Don't hide. So there they are over there. They'll guide you to your workshops. Are you coming in to do? You coming in to do that? Yeah, you're going to do that now. I love the way this is organised. I'm finding out as I go along. It's called ad hoc. Right, you come in and do it now. Do you want to do it from here, or are you going to explain? Well, thank you very much and have a lovely afternoon. Thank you. Do you want to do it from here?